Rain blurred the glass walls of the conference room as Ethan Vale checked his watch for the second time in a minute. The city below looked smeared, like a painting someone had tried to wash away. He exhaled, slow and tight, and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt beneath his tailored navy suit. Everything about him, his schedule, his tone, his world, ran on precision. There wasn't room for distraction. Especially not now, with the company on the cusp of its biggest acquisition in a decade. Mr. Vale, his assistant's voice crackled in through the intercom. The nanny agency sent over the final candidate. He blinked, right, the nanny, because life didn't pause just because business was boiling. His daughter, Maddie, was 6 years old and needed someone more stable than the rotation of faceless caregivers who had come and gone since his ex-wife left. "Send her in," he said, not looking up from his screen. He expected the usual, another eager, resume-polished candidate in neutral tones with a sweet smile and thinly veiled nerves. What he didn't expect was her. She walked in like she didn't need permission, not rude, just present, solid, like she'd already survived harder things than his scrutinizing eyes. "Mr. Vale," she said simply. Her voice wasn't sugary or self-conscious. It was calm, grounded. She wore jeans, a soft oatmeal sweater, and a faded red raincoat that she didn't bother to remove. Her brown hair was damp around her temples, curling where it met her neck. No umbrella. He noted that. "Miss Delaney," she said. "Sophie Delaney." He motioned for her to sit and glanced at her file. 29, former elementary school teacher. Left her last post 2 years ago. Background checks cleared. No nonsense. No frills. "I'll be honest," he said, closing the file. "I don't have time for long interviews. This isn't a typical post. My daughter has a routine. I expect that routine maintained. No overstepping. No emotional entanglements. You'll report to the household manager, not to me directly. The job is demanding. The hours are longer than what's fair. And I'm not looking for friends," she cut in. His eyes lifted. She didn't smile, didn't flinch. "You're not looking for friends," she repeated. "Got it, I'm not either." The silence between them was sharp, not hostile, just quiet in a way that suggested they'd both grown used to people talking too much. "She's bright," he said after a beat, "but guarded. Her mother's not in the picture. She doesn't take to strangers." Sophie's voice softened. "She's not supposed to." Ethan studied her again, this time not as an employer but as a man trying to read something beneath the surface. She looked tired, not weary but weathered, like someone who had been built from something stronger than charm. "You're hired," he said. The next morning, the Vale penthouse felt different. It wasn't immediate. Sophie moved through the space without fanfare, unpacking books into Maddie's room, stacking flashcards on the table, humming quietly while she folded a forgotten load of laundry. She didn't try to fill the silences, didn't smile too widely or ask Ethan about his day. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. Maddie, ever the wary observer, watched her from behind corners and beneath her blanket fort. Sophie didn't press. Instead, she sat on the floor near the fort and began reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, leaving space between paragraphs, as though expecting someone to join her. On the third day, Maddie did. By the end of the week, the fort was a castle, and Ethan came home to hear laughter echoing through the halls. It sounded foreign, jarring, like a melody he used to know but hadn't heard in years. He stood in the doorway and watched them, Maddie braiding Sophie's hair while Sophie listened, patient, as if nothing mattered more in the world. Later that night, he caught Sophie in the kitchen, barefoot, wiping down the counters with slow, deliberate strokes. "You don't have to do that," he said. She glanced up. "Do what?" "Clean, cook, stay past hours. It's not in the contract." She rinsed the cloth. "Neither is listening to your daughter talk about clouds for 30 minutes. He folded his arms. "Is that your way of saying I should listen more?" "No," she said, drying her hands. "It's my way of saying she noticed you didn't." That night he didn't sleep. He told himself it was the deal, the logistics, the endless unread emails. But somewhere beneath all that noise was her voice, clear, calm, saying things no one else had dared to say to him in years. He wasn't here to make friends. He had built a life that ran on order, not affection. But she hadn't offered friendship. She had offered something else. Something quieter. something he hadn't realized he missed. And that was more dangerous than he wanted to admit. Ethan wasn't used to the soft interruptions in his world, the subtle shifts. Mornings had always been mechanical, coffee on the timer, news through earbuds, the elevator ride down without eye contact. But now there was the quiet rustle of Sophie packing a lunch Maddie actually wanted to eat. There was the sound of little feet running down the hallway because someone had hidden a plush bear in her backpack with a note that read, "Mission, secret smile. Complete by recess." He didn't comment on any of it. Instead, he told himself he was only observing, not participating, and certainly not affected. But he started coming home earlier. Once, twice, then it became a pattern. Maddie began leaving her drawings on his desk again, something she'd stopped doing a year ago. They were crude sketches, a tall figure in a suit holding hands with a shorter one in pigtails, and recently a third figure had appeared, red coat, always smiling. Ethan didn't know how he felt about that. The line between home and Sophie had blurred too fast. She didn't ask for access, she simply earned it. And Maddie, who once needed coaxing just to sit at the dinner table, now insisted that Sophie stay for meals. On Friday nights, she'd build a nest of pillows in front of the television, begging for a movie. Sophie never said no. She'd sit cross-legged, a bowl of popcorn in her lap, Maddie curled beside her. Sometimes Ethan joined. More often, he'd linger near the doorway, unsure where he belonged in that picture. It was Saturday morning when he finally gave in to impulse. He was sipping black coffee when Sophie walked in from the terrace, hair damp, face flushed from the cold. She'd taken Maddie to a nearby park, again, without being asked. "You could have told me you were taking her out," he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Would you have come?" He didn't answer. She shrugged out of her coat and hung it near the door. "You're welcome to, join next time." "I have meetings. It's Saturday." Ethan looked at her then, really looked. Most people backed down from the weight of his stare. She didn't lean into it either. She just held her ground like someone who had stopped waiting for approval a long time ago. He set his mug down. "You're pushing boundaries." Sophie stepped closer, not in challenge but in understanding. "You want her to be cared for. You don't get to control how she's loved." The words struck deeper than she knew. He didn't respond, and she didn't wait for him to. She turned and walked to Maddie's room, where giggles soon followed. That afternoon, Ethan skipped the gym. He sat at the kitchen table instead, flipping through a proposal draft he couldn't focus on. His mind kept circling the same question. What did Sophie want? Because she wasn't asking for more money, wasn't fishing for attention, wasn't even reacting to him with the kind of performative awe he was used to. She just existed in his space like she belonged there, and maybe that was the part that unsettled him the most. That night after Maddie had gone to bed, he found Sophie sitting alone in the den. No lights, just the flicker of city glow through the wide windows. "Why'd you stop teaching?" he asked, the question surprising even himself. Sophie didn't look away from the skyline. Burnout, grief, a mix. He waited. The silence wasn't a demand, but an opening. She finally turned toward him. "My sister died, car crash, she had 2 kids. I moved in, tried to hold everything together." Ethan didn't breathe. "They had their dad, but he was well," she continued. "So I stayed until the courts figured things out, quit my job, put everything else on hold. When it was done, when they didn't need me anymore, I couldn't go back to the classroom. It felt wrong." He sat down across from her, not saying a word. "I started doing in-home care. 1 kid at a time, felt more human." He studied her face, the edges of tiredness, the strength underneath, not performative, not curated, just there. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She nodded once. "You don't have to be, it just changed how I move through the world." They sat there for a long time. Eventually Sophie stood. "I'm off the clock now. Good night, Mr. Vale." He almost asked her to stay. But he didn't. Instead, he watched her walk away, her footsteps soft but certain. The next morning, Maddie found him at the table and crawled into his lap, something she hadn't done since preschool. "I like her," she said, mouth full of cereal. "I know," he answered. "She likes you too," Maddie added with a smirk. He froze. How do you know? She looks at you like you're not just my dad. Ethan swallowed. And how's that? Like you're a person. That day he canceled his meetings. And he went to the park with them. He didn't say much, didn't need to. Because Sophie smiled when she saw him approach, not with surprise, not with sarcasm, but with a quiet kind of knowing. Like she'd known he'd come around. Eventually, the air had shifted between them, not with declarations or grand gestures, but in the pauses that stretched and softened, in the way their eyes held a beat longer than necessary, in the comfort of shared silence. Still, nothing was said aloud. Sophie continued her routine as if the park visit had been no different than any other day. Ethan, however, began noticing everything. He noticed how she always smelled faintly of lavender and rain when she came in from errands, how she used both hands when tying Maddie's shoes, even though she could do it one-handed, how she never touched her phone when Maddie was around, as though being fully present was a promise she refused to break. He started waiting for the moment she'd speak, even if it was about what groceries were low or whether Maddie should try piano instead of ballet. Her voice had become familiar in the most unfamiliar way, not an intrusion but an anchor. It scared him how much he looked forward to it. One night he came home later than usual, his tie half loosened, jacket still in the back seat of his car. The deal he'd worked months on had imploded without warning, and his usual response, fix, dominate, control, felt uncharacteristically heavy, hollow. The apartment was dark except for the reading lamp in the living room. Sophie was curled in the corner of the couch, a thick blanket wrapped around her knees, a book open in her lap. She looked up, saw his face, closed the book. "No one's bleeding," she said. "That's something." It wasn't a joke exactly, but it landed gently. He sat down across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "I lost the Simcoe deal." She didn't offer a platitude or advice. She didn't tell him everything happened for a reason. She just sat there, blanket bunched in her hands, listening. After a while, he leaned back into the couch and stared at the ceiling. "I don't think I even wanted it," he admitted. She tilted her head. "Then why did you fight so hard for it?" "Because I was supposed to." Sophie drew her legs beneath her, watching him the way one watches someone coming undone, not in chaos, but in quiet. "It's okay to want something else," she said. He met her gaze. "And what if I don't know what that is?" "Then maybe you're finally free enough to find out." The next morning, he didn't go into the office. He made pancakes with Maddie instead, badly. Burnt edges and too much batter, and Sophie's laughter filled the kitchen like it belonged there. He found himself looking for ways to stay in the same room with her, even if it meant pretending to care about which towels matched the bathroom best or whether Maddie's new sneakers were half a size too small. Later that week, she asked for a Saturday off. He blinked, startled by the suggestion. "You need a break." "Just a weekend," she said, tying her hair back. "A friend getting married out of town." He hated how the idea unsettled him. "Of course," he said. The apartment felt different without her. Too clean, too quiet. He found himself reaching for her voice in the empty space. Even Maddie was out of sorts, wandering from room to room like she'd lost something and couldn't name it. On Sunday evening, the front door opened with a soft click. Sophie came in with her suitcase trailing behind her and a new freckle across the bridge of her nose from the sun. Maddie launched into her arms. Ethan hovered in the hallway, unsure whether to say welcome back or pretend like she'd never left. She looked at him, sensing the hesitation. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey." And then, because he wasn't a man who stumbled over words, except when he was, he added, "The apartment felt wrong without you." Sophie stilled. There was no flush in her cheeks, no flattered gasp. Just a quiet breath, like she'd been waiting for honesty to enter the room. "I missed her too," she said, nodding toward Maddie. He didn't miss the subtext, but she didn't press. She never did. Another week passed. Then two. They settled into something that wasn't defined but still held them. A rhythm, until the storm came. A phone call unexpected, Maddie's school, a playground accident. Ethan left a boardroom full of investors mid-pitch, without apology. He arrived at the hospital to find Sophie already there, her arms wrapped around a teary Maddie, a small bandage on the girl's temple. "She's okay," Sophie said before he could ask. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, pulling Maddie to him. "What happened?" "Sophie ran faster than anyone," Maddie said, muffled into his chest. "She didn't even put on her shoes." Ethan looked over. Sophie's feet were bare beneath her jeans. "You were already gone," she said simply. Something inside him cracked open. She hadn't called for him to come, she hadn't waited. She had acted, because she'd seen Maddie as hers to protect, not just his. That night, after Maddie had fallen asleep with a cool cloth on her forehead, Ethan walked into the kitchen where Sophie stood pouring tea. "Do you ever let anyone take care of you?" he asked. She didn't turn, not often. "Why?" "Because they don't usually stay long enough." He moved closer. "I'm still here." She finally looked up. And for the first time, she didn't shield anything behind calm or quiet. Her eyes were wide, unsure. So he stepped forward again. Closer. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The air between them was already doing the work. She whispered, "You said you weren't here to make friends." "I'm not," he said, "but you never offered me friendship." She swallowed. "What did I offer?" "Something I didn't think I deserved." Her breath caught. He took the mug from her hands, set it on the counter behind them. And this time when he leaned in, it wasn't a question. She met him there. Not with fireworks or heat, but with something steadier. A promise not yet spoken. The kiss lingered long after it ended. Not because it had been dramatic or urgent, it hadn't. It was quiet, searching, a kind of leaning in neither of them had done in a long time. It left behind the weight of awareness, a shift that couldn't be reversed. Ethan hadn't planned on saying anything afterward, but Sophie had stepped back, her hand falling to her side like something she didn't know what to do with, and the space between them suddenly felt fragile. "I didn't mean for that to happen like this," he said. She didn't meet his eyes, but it did. "Yes." He waited, but she didn't respond, didn't reach for him, didn't run either. Just stood there. "I'm not expecting anything," he added. "That's part of the problem, Ethan." Her voice was steady, but something in it trembled. "You never expect anything, not from people, not for yourself." He opened his mouth, closed it. She stepped around him, pausing at the hallway. "I need to check on Maddie." She didn't look back. The days that followed unfolded like nothing had happened. Except everything had. Sophie remained as committed, as consistent, as present, but something subtle had changed. She no longer lingered in the kitchen after dinner. She no longer accepted his silent invitations to sit on the balcony once Maddie had gone to bed. She was careful, respectful, guarded. Ethan, for the first time in years, felt helpless. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. In business, he moved through pressure with strategy, but this wasn't a negotiation. This was something more delicate, and he was clumsy in it. By the end of the week, he asked her to sit down. They were in the den. The city lights cast a dull glow on the hardwood floor. "I crossed a line," he said. She didn't deny it. "I think I've been using work to avoid things I didn't know how to want." Sophie folded her hands in her lap. "Like what?" "Closeness, mess, you." That word sat between them for a long moment. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know, but I'm still here." She leaned back, finally letting out a slow breath. "This isn't about owing, Ethan. It's about whether you can exist in a space without trying to control it." "I'm trying. I can see that." They didn't touch, they didn't fall into each other. They just sat, two people confronting the shape of something neither had asked for but now couldn't unsee. The next morning, Sophie took Maddie to the botanical gardens. When they came back, Ethan was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, making pasta sauce from scratch. Badly. The garlic had burned and the noodles stuck together in one large clump. Sophie stared at the mess. "I Googled a recipe," he said. "I can tell." He offered her a sheepish smile. Maddie beamed. "Daddy, cooking." They ate it anyway. Later, while Maddie slept, Sophie found him rinsing the dishes, his hair damp from the steam, his dress shirt splattered with sauce. "I got a call this morning," she said, leaning against the counter. He turned, drying his hands. "From who?" "A school, a private one, upstate. They need a counselor. Offered me a place to live. It's quiet, community-based." He felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. "Are you thinking of taking it?" "I was, but then we kissed." He stiffened. "I don't want to confuse Maddie," she added, "and I don't want to confuse myself." "So that's it?" he asked. "You leave because something real happened?" She didn't flinch. "It's not that something happened, it's that I care what happens next." He stepped forward. "I don't want you to go." "I know," she said softly, "but wanting me to stay and being ready for what that means, they're not the same." He looked away, jaw tight. "You think I can't handle it?" "I think you're still learning how to let someone in." The honesty stung. But it was also true. He nodded once. "If you need to go, I won't stop you." She swallowed hard. "I'll finish out the week. I owe that to Maddie." She turned, walking slowly down the hall. Ethan stood there for a long time, the tap dripping behind him, the air thick with the silence of things unsaid. The next few days passed like a countdown neither of them acknowledged. Maddie didn't understand, not fully. She only knew Sophie was packing her books and folding her sweaters, and that Daddy seemed quieter than usual. On Sophie's last night, they all had dinner together. Maddie insisted on wearing her favorite pajamas and invited Sophie to sleep in her room on a sleeping bag. Sophie agreed, even though she hadn't planned to. After Maddie drifted off, Sophie emerged into the hallway. Ethan was waiting in the living room, staring at nothing. "I didn't expect this to be so hard," he said. "I didn't either." He stood, crossed the room. "But maybe I needed to lose something real to realize what I'm actually afraid of." Sophie met his gaze. "And what's that?" "Needing someone." She waited. "And not being enough for them." The quiet between them was heavy, but not hopeless. "I never asked you to be perfect, Ethan," she said. "I know, that's what scares me." Sophie stepped forward. "Then maybe that's where you start." He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to ask her to stay. But instead, he did the one thing he'd never done before. He let her go. Watched her gather her things the next morning with red-rimmed eyes and a small smile for Maddie. He hugged her once tightly on the curb outside the building. Neither said goodbye. Because maybe they both understood. This wasn't the end. Autumn came slow that year. It crept in through chilled morning air and leaves turning burnt gold across the park where Ethan now spent every Saturday with Maddie. The crisp wind bit a little harder, and still, he walked the same path Sophie used to take. Maddie would skip ahead, her scarf trailing behind her, her laughter bouncing off the concrete like it had rediscovered its place. She still asked about Sophie sometimes, never accusing, just curious. "Do you think she'll visit?" Ethan would nod, brushing a hand over her head. "I hope so." He didn't lie, but he didn't promise. Sophie had been gone for 2 months. Upstate wasn't far, but it may as well have been another world. They exchanged a few messages, short, polite. She sent a picture of a small classroom with soft light falling across the desks. He'd replied with one of Maddie on Halloween dressed as a sunflower. The kind of threadbare tether people use when they don't know what else to say but don't want to let go completely. Still, she haunted the apartment, not in any dramatic way, but in the muscle memory of routines she had shaped. The fridge still held the brand of oat milk she preferred. Maddie still asked for the old lullaby Sophie used to hum. Ethan sometimes caught himself turning to mention something and then remembering she wasn't there. He hadn't brought anyone new into Maddie's life, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to pretend. And the truth was, no one filled the space Sophie had left. She hadn't taken anything tangible, but she'd left her presence like an imprint on the furniture, on the rhythm of their days, on him. Then in early November, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text, a real letter addressed in Sophie's handwriting. Maddie found it first and carried it inside like it was sacred. Ethan read it alone, standing at the kitchen counter. Ethan, I've replayed that last night 100 times, not because I regret leaving, but because I needed to be sure I didn't leave out of fear. It turns out I didn't. I left because I needed to believe you'd choose something without needing to be rescued first. I didn't want to be another problem you solved. I wanted to be the person you chose when everything was already standing still, when there was no storm to weather. And if that day ever comes, if you wake up and the silence feels too heavy and the stillness starts to ache, I'll be up here, not waiting, but hoping. Give Maddie a squeeze for me. Yes. He read it twice, then a third time. And then he did what he never used to do. He stopped working for the rest of the day. He took Maddie to the bookstore Sophie used to take her to, let her pick 3 books instead of 1. They sat at the cafe window with hot chocolate and a cookie Maddie didn't finish. Ethan watched her, her feet swinging beneath the stool, and realized something that landed so quietly it almost didn't register. He missed Sophie because she was part of their life, not a complication, not an outsider, but someone who'd shown up and stayed until he finally saw what he'd been avoiding. He had made a life of control, of structure and distance. He had raised walls and called them protection, but Sophie had seen through them, not to break them down, but to remind him there was more. And now he was ready. The next weekend, he made the drive. It rained the whole way up, a soft, misty rain that turned the roads slick and the hills a deep, mossy green. The small town came into view like something drawn from memory. He hadn't asked if she'd be home. He hadn't told her he was coming. The school was closed for the weekend, but the side path was unlocked and he walked it, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders braced against the cold. She was in the garden behind the staff cottages, crouched beside a row of sleeping flowers, trimming back stems for winter. Her hair was tied up in a loose knot, and she was wearing an old sweatshirt he didn't recognize. Her hands were covered in earth. She saw him before he spoke. Stood slowly. Neither moved for a moment. Then her voice, quieter than he remembered, but steady. Didn't think you'd come. He stepped closer. I didn't know if I was ready, but I think I was waiting for a moment when everything felt safe, and I realized that might never come. She wiped her hands on a towel. You don't have to say anything. I do, he said, because I wasn't just afraid of needing you. I was afraid of you needing me and not measuring up. You didn't have to measure, she said. You just had to show up. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Maddie's newest drawing, one of their little family, with a red cottage in the background. She asked me last week if love is something that fades. Sophie blinked. I told her no, it's something that waits, he said, if it's real. She took the paper in her hands, fingers trembling. Is that what this is? I think it could be, he said, if you still want to find out. Sophie didn't smile. She just stepped forward, closed the space between them, and rested her forehead against his chest. His hands found her back. And in that soft hush of a garden preparing for winter, Ethan Vale, CEO, strategist, builder of walls, held the woman who had never offered him friendship. She had offered him a way back to himself. To love not as a solution, but as a quiet unfolding. And for the first time, he didn't need to control it. He simply stayed.